Hey, Terry Caliendo of Dedicated Managers here again, and I had to create this flow chart for the program because I honestly got so confused by what was going on myself. I had some redundancies going on where some output was repeating itself and it was inefficient, so I had to figure out what was going wrong. And honestly, going back looking at the code, I confused myself because there's a lot of recursivity, if that's a word. There's a lot of recursiveness going on. You can see that this get entity, which I can zoom in here, this get entity function here gets called a bunch of different times from a bunch of different places as things are going on, or at least parts of it are getting called. So I had to do this flow chart to debug and figure out what was going wrong, because a lot of different asynchronous things are happening at the same time, and it's hard to follow the code straight through. So I kind of wanted to just walk through this to kind of show how the program works. I thought it was kind of interesting. So let's take a look at the program here. So this is the main program. I have one client created, and I want to show adding a sub-entity to that client because that's the most interesting case. So if I load this client in, I've now got that client loaded. You can see I got a little bit of output that I'm not concerned about right now. Where I want to start talking about is when I click to add a child to this parent. So the primary kinship caregiver, this is the parent entity, and I want to start adding some children to it, some nested entities, where I can add multiple income, or I can add multiple children to the parent, because that makes sense in the database, right? If the child has 5 kids, these 5 kids need to be attached to this parent caregiver. So let's go ahead and click. I'll click Add Child, and we'll walk through the flow chart as far as what's happening. So when I click Add Child, you see there's a whole bunch of output that happens down here, and that's what we're going to talk about in relation to the flow chart. So the first thing that happens, that already happened, that I cleared out, was that the client container got loaded. And the client container holds, it's basically the router component that is everything in this area. This is the main area that gets loaded, and it's determined by the route. And so it's the main Vue component that's loaded, and then it's going to load these sub components depending on what needs to be loaded. And right now the kinship child needs to be loaded, so that's what's showing up here. So it's loading within itself the kinship child component. So if we go into back to the Vue, I'm just telling you that because this client container has already been loaded. We've already done this stuff where I've chosen whether or not I'm in a different entity or not. So don't worry about that right now. What we need to worry about is that we're getting into here where we're getting into get entity. So if I go back to the load here, we can see the kinship child view was created. So that tells us we're in this view, which is the kinship child. We're no longer viewing that parent entity, which was this one, me as the parent, Terry Caliendo. So now I'm going to call get entity, and I'm saying, hey, I output the object that I received, which is the doc ID is add. I don't have a document ID yet. Well, I didn't before everything happened. It happened so fast you probably didn't see it, but I've talked about this in the past. This starts out as add, and that's where we are in this state right here when we get this document. The document ID coming in as add. So I'm going to put that back. It comes in as add, and so in the flow chart, we say, hey, are we adding a new entity? And we do that check based on what came in. And so yes, we're loading a new entity. So we're going to call fCreateEntity. So when we go back here, we're on fCreateEntity. That same add object was obviously passed in because I need to know about that. And so now we're going to ask, we're going to look at the sub-entity part. If I go back to the flow chart, we're going to ask, is this a sub-entity? And yes, it was. So we're going to create info about itself to store when we create the new entity. So remember, this entire thing that we're loading here is a child. We're creating a child of this parent, Terry. So yes, the answer was we do have a parent. So we have to create this information about the parent on the child and say, hey, child, you have a parent type of primary kinship caregiver, and your parent collection ID is this MG number, MGD. So that tells the child that it has a parent, and then some asynchronous activity happens here. The primary kinship caregiver view has now been destroyed, so that took a little while. It happened asynchronously to our program control, and that's just showing up now. So we've loaded this we're in the add state here. We've loaded this new view and destroyed the parent view. That's gone. So now we're going to call the Firestore, and we're going to add that new entity using that sub-entity meta that we talked about, that's going to tell this child that it has a parent. So that gets loaded, that gets completed, and so now we're back here. We're in the Firestore. We added that entity using the information about its parent. That entity is now created. So now two things are going to happen. We have to go and tell the parent entity that it now has a child. So that's what this is. We're going to dispatch, we're going to update the current entity. The current entity can be any one of our either parent or child entities. It's an object that holds a lot of information, the current entity object. But we're going to go update the parent one and tell the parent that it now has a child based on the child's information. The child created the new entity and came back with its ID, and so it's going to go and use its ID to tell the parent that it has a child. So let's take a look at what happens there. So the Firestore created the new entity. It created a new entity with the ID OVB. And so now we're going to call that update current entity on the parent. We're calling the parent, which is MG. That's what we told it back here in the subentity meta local. We told the child that it had a parent of MG. And that got stored when we created the new entity. And now after we're creating that new entity, we got to go and tell the parent MG, we have to go and tell the parent MG that it now has a child, type kinship child of OV, and that's what got created here. So we created that new function, that new entity. While we created it, we told it it had a parent, and then when we got the ID back, now that we've got an ID for the child, we can go and tell the parent that it has a child of ID OV. And so that's what happens there. And so when we call this update current entity, it actually does a couple things. So let's go look at the chart again. So we're dispatching to update the parent. So that's now we're here. My arrows got bent a little bit. But that flow comes to down here. These two things are going to happen. We'll come back and talk about the dispatch of the get entity of the child. But now we're talking about the parent. So we take that information about the child and we send it to the parent. We have to commit it locally. So that's the local commit to our Vuex storage. We have to tell the child locally, or the parent locally, that it has a child. We commit that information to it, and then we call fcommit entity, which goes and updates that information in the Firestore database. And anytime we make an update on an entity, regardless of where that change came from, if it came locally or if it came from another live client that's might be working on this same entity, we get a callback on this listener that's attached to that parent entity. So we made a change to the parent here, and so it's going to automatically call a callback to this listener. It's going to fire this listener and now do some work on that parent entity. So that's what happened here, is we're mutating the parent entity, and then we're committing the parent entity. Remember, the parent entity was MG, so we committed MG. We mutated MG, and now we're committing MG. And remember, those are the commit is synchronous, but the fcommit is asynchronous. So while that's happening, in the meantime, the view is changing what it looks like. So it's changing from /add, which was here, to this full route here, which has the child's ID in it. And so that's what was there before I changed it to add. So now we're updated. We're here. It's empty. There's no information yet because it's brand newly created. But that created our view change, and then I just let myself know that the router board before each was called and nothing happened special in there, so there was no other output for that. But now back to where we are here, we're still doing this call to the update to the parent. We did the mutate. Now we're doing the commit. Anytime a commit happens on an entity, the Firestore fires off a action to the listener and tells the listener, hey, something happened, so call your listener. And so now we're going to be in the entity listener, which we should see here. We're in the entity listener for that primary, for that parent, which is the caregiver, the Terry Caliendo, the parent, the MG ID. So now what is it going to do? Well, let's look through the flow chart. It's going to say, hey, does the entity exist? I don't output that yes, it does. I actually output no if it doesn't, and I don't have that documented here what happens. But basically, we can get to this entity listener, like I said, from a bunch of different ways. One of those ways could be that either in the database or on another parent or even locally, the entity was deleted. The parent entity that we're talking about, the MV or whatever it was entity, has been destroyed. So if it has been, then we do some other stuff that I haven't documented yet. But that hasn't happened in our case. We've just updated the parent. So we're coming here. So yes, the parent still exists. We've made a change to it. And so now we say, hey, are there nested collections that don't yet have listeners on them? Well, yes, we just created a child that has that listener. And so we stored that in the Firebase and locally. So yes, we're gonna end up calling something that goes and loads that child. So, whoops, wrong one. If we look here, I'm now in that get entity. I'm checking for nested collections of the parent. That's this right here. We're checking for nested collections. And I did find one. I found a nested entity, and it did not have a listener yet. So that's obviously my new child that was created and updated on the parent. So it's going to go out and call get entity on that child. And so we need to load that entity local. Now that entity, remember when I created the entity up here, when it was in the add state, it creates it, but I don't have any listeners, and it's not officially added yet, even though I've redirected to this route that calls this child thing. It's not loaded yet. So that's what this does, is this listener goes out and it gets that entity. Even though there's no information displayed, there is some information that was created, and that's the the created at and the user ID that created it, the method, the timestamp, and it's a whole nother thing I need to talk about. But there's some information on this child that was created that we stored on the child that we need to now go and get because we didn't save it locally yet. So it goes and gets it. Where was I? It was right here. The listener was not found, so we called to load the child entity. So now we're loading that meta information, and now we're in sync with what's happening here. Once that gets loaded, so get entity goes out and gets it. It received the object and loads it locally. So go back to this here. That's their nested collections that don't yet have listeners. Yes, go and get them. So I'm going to get that child now. So that calls back here and goes back to this get entity and runs this whole thing again. Well, for the child, no, we're not adding a new one because it's already created. There's no listeners on it, so we don't have to unsubscribe any listeners. There's no previous entity that needs to be removed. That's different functionality. And so here's where the Firestore actually goes and gets the entity, and then it runs this same recursive functionality on the child. Yes, the child exists. No, the child does not have any nested collections yet. So it's done. It commits it to the local storage, the Vuex storage, and I guess I don't output for that. Shoot, I just loaded. I didn't want to load that. So I don't have output for that it was loaded locally, but it gets saved locally in the Vuex storage. And so that child recursive loop is done, we did that. Now if we come back here and we were still talking about the parent, remember we came this way. On the parent, we loaded this listener, we did the child thing, loaded through, and now we're back on the parent. So now we're also going to commit the parent locally. So the parent's going to load its info into the Vuex. Now that's probably redundant. I should look at that for the parent, because remember we updated the parent back here locally, and then we did this updated in the Firestore, and then we come back here and ultimately we end up loading it again. I have to look at that, but where I was having problems was this nested child was getting loaded, and I didn't realize why, because I didn't have this drawn through to figure it out. So that's the process for the parent. The parent got updated, it came through, it loaded the child as part of its process, and then the child went through, it didn't need to do anything, it just loaded locally, and then so did the parent. So that loop kind of recursively happened there. So that was this step. And now we dispatch getEntity on the child. And this is where actually I think I need to take this out, because now this is obviously redundant, because I don't need to call this getChild, because ultimately the child got called through the nested collection of the parent when the parent got called. So that's where I had to figure that out. And I think I did remove that in this source code here in the store. I think I end up here removing. So this is that I call this getEntity on the child, and so I just commented it out for now to say that it's no longer needed. That's actually this step right here is this child doesn't need to go and update itself because it's ultimately getting loaded through the update of the parent as part of that recursive functionality. So you can see if I step back here, again, a lot of things are going on, and so that's why I had to draw this picture to really figure out what was happening there. So I think I've actually deleted this. I need to update the documentation. So I guess that's not quite right. But that's the loop, extra loop that was causing two things to happen for that same child. Now, one more thing to just quickly talk about. I've talked about this in the past. You would think when I go from add to this, you would think that when I reload this child, I would call to get that entity, but that doesn't happen because my loading happens when the client container is loaded, and the child view, there's no functionality in the child view, which is, where's that income? So this is the primary kinship caregiver income view that we're looking at. It doesn't have, on its created function, all it looks for is the add view. There's no other looking for a change of this add to something else. So that's why that needs to be done asynchronously. And also, once a view is loaded, the add view, this view here versus this view here with an ID, an actual ID, they are actually the same view. And I've talked about this in the past. And so when it loads from one view to the other of the same view, this view does not get destroyed. The kinship child, even though it loaded first for just a blank add and then refreshed itself to load the actual view, again, that was the reroute that happened, and I don't think I have that in my diagram, but that's what happened here after we we created that new child. Whoops. We created that new child, and then we go and we replaced the router. We replaced the view, but it's the same. This ADD is the same route as this, this with the actual ID. So view, if the view is not destroyed, it doesn't destroy the route to come back to the same place. It reuses the old functionality. So that's why it's not loaded as part of that. I've talked about that in the past, though. So anyway, that was kind of long-winded at the end. But the main thing to take away from here is that there is now a flow chart that you can kind of look at and see how complicated this program has actually become, in that it's very dynamic, in that I'm reusing functionality for various levels. So that same functionality, if I'm adding a child here, or if I'm adding a child here, or any one of these things that are nested entities that I can have multiple of. Whoops, let's add it. I don't know why that's not working. I probably I lost my listener there. That's something I have to figure out. It's a bug. But if I reload, and I start to add children, this is child 1, add a child 2. The functionality to do that, it's calling the same functions as it is to add this child 1 and this child 2. The create of the new entities and stuff like that, and updating the parent, all those functions are the same functions, just reused. So kind of had to draw this picture to figure out where I am when certain things are happening. So that's the high level picture. That is now embedded in the repository as of this commit here. So something to look at, a little more interesting. Anyway, Terry Caliendo, 21 minutes of talking, pretty amazing. My voice is already tired. Happy, what is it, July 30th? And good programming, good luck to you. Hopefully you're still enjoying these outputs. If anybody's actually listening to all this work that I'm doing, thank you for paying attention and learning. And if you want to contact me, feel free to contact me at dedicatedmanagers.com or write something in the comments. Take care. Have a great day.